Hey guys, so I gotta make at least 2 more videos for the weekend since I'm gonna be gone. Yeah, I might as well make them while I'm driving, because what else am I gonna do, right? I just been listening to a lot of Rick and Morty videos. I've already talked my piece on that show so far. Like I said, with Justin Roiland, not really sure how much of what he did is actually true. And I have a distinct feeling that a lot of what he did isn't true. So I'm going to make this into a kind of a weird segue to George W. Bush. But before I get into that, I just want to get into kind of a little bit of history, okay? This is specifically about 9/11, alright? And into the whole weapons of mass destruction discussion. Now, again, when I make these videos, I'm trying to hit on history and kind of explain exactly how things turned out the way that they turned out. The reason I bring up lies and that kind of scenarios is not because I believe in all the conspiracies, but because you still need a little bit of background to actually discuss a lot of this stuff. So, back in the day, it was described, I'm talking about Afghanistan now. Afghanistan was described as the graveyard of empires. Now that's not really true. For Alexander the Great, he did die young and his empire fell apart, but it had nothing to do with Afghanistan. His soldiers were just really sick of always fighting constantly, never being allowed to go home, not knowing if their next battle was going to be their last. They wanted to take their riches and bring it back to their families, bring back countless treasures and war stories, to actually have families for the ones that were too young to ever have children or get married. So eventually they forced Alexander the Great to go back. And he decided to be a little bit petulant about it. He brought his army through the desert. And it's assumed that he did it to punish them, to show them like true suffering, that they could have followed him all the way to India and conquered a vast empire in his name. But because they refused, he was going to give them punishment. And eventually, he ended up dying. Now, there is a possibility that his generals actually offed him because of what he did, because of dragging them through the desert, and that they're the ones who injured him or caused him to get injured, and that gave him the infection that ended his life. And since he died without an heir, his empire broke into 4 pieces. Now, if you ever played Rome Total War 2, you know some of those pieces. So it wasn't really Afghanistan that caused the breakup, but that was long before the people of Afghanistan started to come around. You see, back in the day, before Islam existed, there were local peoples there, like the Sukhalids. The Sukhalids, specifically, I believe, were actually one of the empires that followed in the wake of Alexander the Great. But they were known as well as the Persians for their brilliant horse archers. And eventually, people from the steppes, all the way from Mongolia, would come into the area and settle in that area and conquer it, and form relationships with the people in Russia, Ukraine, and even down to Persia. And they would eventually become Islamic. And these people would become part of, or at least intermix and become part of the Turks and the Afghanis. Now the Afghanis were known for being a mountainous people, and they got used to being high up, so much so that when our soldiers eventually went over there, they would see Afghanis smoking cigarettes up in those high mountains, riding around like lunatics, while our men could barely all the street lights around in this area. It's going to be dark for a while. Sorry about that, guys. Anyways, these guys were absolutely nutso. And eventually, these poor guys would form an empire, more or less, which would collapse every now and again. And even though there were Hinduists in the area and Buddhists in the area making their own monuments, eventually a group known as the Taliban took over the country, and they became best friends with an Islamic terrorist group. And you might know them very, very well as Al-Qaeda. But before Al-Qaeda was a thing, there was the Mujahideen. Now the Mujahideen is kind of like the modern day Kurds. You see, with the modern day Kurds, they have many different ideologies, but they want their own freedom. Now the Kurds were screwed over during World War I. And yes, I keep jumping all around the timeline here, but keep with me. During World War I, Lawrence of Arabia came to the Middle East to form basically a rebel group to fight against the Axis, or the Central Powers, as they were called at the time. They were called the Axis during the Second World War. But during the First World War, they were known as the Central Powers. That being Austria, Turkey, also known as the Ottoman Empire, Italy, and Germany. Now, he formed a good relationship with a family you might recognize, and that was the Hassan family, or Hussein family. Now, this is a little bit different from Saddam Hussein, a different branch at least, but they promised that the Hussein family would become the new rulers of the Middle East, that they would become kings and princes, sort of like the Saudi princes are nowadays. However, Lawrence of Arabia offered a solution to how the Middle East should be broken up. And it was not a great solution, but it was better than the one that the Allied powers landed on. You see, the Allied powers decided that they would break up the Middle East however they wanted, breaking it up between France and Britain, and that they would break up the Ottoman Empire, and they would give small pieces to each part of the Saddam family. The father would get half of the Saudi peninsula, one of the sons would get Jordan, and another one of the sons would get Iraq, I believe. And eventually the father was overthrown by the Saudis. Now the Saudis had their own ideas on how they should rule over the area. And they formed their own princedoms with their own king. Now during the Mujahideen, much later on, by the way, the Iraq dynasty also fell, and the only one that survived was the Jordan dynasty. which would eventually betray the West when it decided that it didn't want Israel to exist. Now, Jordan is one of the more reasonable countries in the area, which is not saying a lot given that they had declared war on Israel several times. But by the time of the Soviet Union, long after World War II, the Mujahideen had formed in the Middle East. And the Mujahideen, as I mentioned before, are like the modern-day Kurds. The Kurds believe in many different ideologies. Some of them believe in a democracy, some of them want a republic, some of them want a communist government, some want an Islamic government, kind of like Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Afghanistan or what have you. But the reason why I mentioned World War I is because the Kurds were left without a homeland. All the areas around them were basically set up without them in mind. Now they have people inside Afghanistan, in Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. And I think they have a few people in Azerbaijan, or not Azerbaijan, its neighboring country, Armenia, that's it. I think they have a few people in Armenia. Anyways, the Mujahideen were a lot similar. They had groups of people that wanted a republic. They had groups of people that wanted a democracy. Ones that wanted communism. And then one that wanted an Islamic government. Now, the Islamic government and the communists in many parts of the Middle East formed an alliance. And after the communists helped the Islamic extremists, or the Islamist is what I'm trying to say. Not every Islamist is a terrorist, but there are a few bit of them in there, scattered. Anyways, when the communists helped the Islamists take over the Middle East in many different places, the communists invariably were mass executed, with only left a few rebel groups here and there that believed in democracy. One of these was starts with an M. It's like it's not like Mussolini, it's like, it's not Muhammad. Mursini or something like that? Anyways, the Mujahideen eventually broke apart, and they were bribed. A lot of the people who wanted a more terrorist government, who formed Al-Qaeda, were funded by a Saudi prince, or at least somebody who was vastly rich, and you would know him as, God, I can't even remember his name. Saddam Hussein. Not Saddam Hussein. Oh, sorry, my God. Bin Laden, sorry. Bin Laden, my bad. It's been so long since he's been killed that I completely forgot he exists. Osama bin Laden. Yes, him. He, as well with many other Saudis, eventually planned the 9/11 attacks. And while there were still people in Afghanistan who believed in a democracy, like Ahmed was killed not long before the 9/11 attacks happened. About a few days before, in fact. Now, his son survived him, and his son was pretty young at the time. Eventually we went into Afghanistan and took out the government there, tried to take care of Al-Qaeda, eliminated them to the best of our ability until they got replaced by ISIS and ISIL and ISIS-K. 3 different organizations, trust me on this. And the Saudis were eventually, well, basically, let's just say that they were not very pleased with some members of the royal family who supported the terrorist. And they had to agree some very strict terms here or there. But Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, had caused us more than a few issues during Desert Storm when he attacked Kuwait. Now, if you don't know, Kuwait is a small regional government that formed its own country. Now, by all rights, they should be part of Iraq, but they have been separated from so long from Iraq that they didn't want to be part of that, well, let's say terrorist-supporting country. So they got invaded by Saddam Hussein. And we weren't able to oust him during that war, which meant that a lot of people inside the government, the kind of people that hold on to the position for decades at a time, kind of like Fauci, but, part of the industrial war complex, the industrial military complex, decided that they weren't going to let his survival fly. So they came up with the idea of weapons of mass destruction. Now, he did have chemical weapons, mostly chemical weapons that we had given him. But that was enough justification for us to lie about it and go in and take him out. Now, where I kind of lose people, or where I kind of get lost, is like whether or not George W. Bush knew it was a lie or not. Because after all, he's not the one to do the intel briefings. The intel briefings are given to him by people who, have their own riddle ideas on how the world should work. And while George W. Bush was treated like an idiot, I'm in agreement with Styx Hexenhammer on this, is that he is not an idiot. Whether or not he was lied to or not, or he decided to just go along with the whole charade, is of no real concern to me. As far as I'm concerned, Saddam Hussein got everything that happened to him. The problem is that he was replaced democratically by a government that wasn't really keen on the United States. This country has been, well, to say that they're neutral is probably the best you could ever say about them. They don't have, well, let's just say that they abstained when most of the world decided to condemn Russia. Which, to be fair, them staying out of it was probably a good idea. Especially since they got ISIS problems of their own. And because of that, they also got Kurd problems. Because the Kurds and ISIS really don't like each other. But since the Kurds are there, they also got problems from Turkey, occasionally bombing their territory. Now, again, I'm bringing this up for more historical purposes, more than anything, and not so much about whether or not George W. Bush actually lied about the whole thing. But because of that, the Republicans became, well, let's just say very unpopular. And since George W. Bush was the son of George H.W. Bush, who was the vice president of Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush completely botched his presidency, allowing Bill Clinton to become president. Well, let's just say that whole family, along with Reagan, would be what you would call somewhat rhinos and somewhat warmongers. Reagan really did a lot of good during his term, but he set up a lot of dominoes that caused issues down the road. Now, whether or not George W. Bush was actually responsible for the economic crisis during his time, and whether or not he led to a bunch of rhinos taking over the party, again, that's for other people to debate. someday I'll probably get into it, but not until I've done a lot of research on it. But what's definitely true is it led to generations of presidents that cared more about their little own personal wars, which included George H.W. Bush, Clinton. Carter might be in there at some point, but, well, he was before Reagan, I think. I'm sorry. I know a lot about history, but the order of the presidents, Carter caused a lot of issues. And he died way after Reagan did. Because, man, Carter held on for a very long time. That poor man. But, hey, Carter did one good thing. He did get rid of parasites. Not all parasites, mind you, but the, oh, God, I forget the name of the species. But it was a bad parasite. For the most part. And then Carter, Reagan, H.W. Bush, Clinton, Bush, then Obama, then Biden. All of them had wars that they fought. People that they wanted dead. Whereas Trump has been the only one who has not wanted any, like, major conflicts. He just wanted to take out terrorists, and only the terrorists. He didn't want to overthrow governments, he wanted to stabilize governments. Only take care of the most evil elements inside of the world, which he doesn't get enough credit for. But, hey, like I said, I'll continue this video, I guess tomorrow. This will be my Saturday video. And then tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about this, which to me will only be a few minutes after this one. But that's it for now, guys. Continue this tomorrow.